Hello everybody, my name is Happy and I'd like to welcome you all to my history reaction channel. Well, it's still October and I'm trying to do at least one video per week that features something related to ghosts, goblins, and things that go bump in the night. And for this week we're going to take a little bit of a twist and we're going to head over to Ireland for some Irish folklore. And I know we tend to think of Irish folklore, we tend to think of the little people and the fairy folk, the leprechauns and the puka, creatures like that. Sometimes troublesome, sometimes mischievous, but not particularly scary unless we're talking about the Leprechaun TV or movie series, but that's an entirely different thing. However, Irish folklore does have its dark side. Most of us are probably familiar with the Banshee, the Wailing Herald of Death, the Dullahan, the Headless Horseman archetype. But what we're going to talk about is Fear Gorta and Féar Gorta, the Hungry Man and the Hungry Grass. And yes, they sound alike. The word for man, var, is very similar to the word for grass, fair. Gorta is hungry or famine. An Gorta Mór is the Great Hunger, the Great Famine. That's the famine in the 1840s that most of us are familiar with. So you can see where this is coming from. And these are often associated with that famine, but their origins are much older. Ireland has a history of famine, and the idea of the hungry man and the hungry grass had been around for a very long time. Ireland had a massive famine in the 1700s, much worse than any of the ones that they had in the 1800s. In terms of percentage of population that actually died, what sets the 1840s famine, especially 1847, Black 47, apart is A, it's more recent, and B, it was totally preventable. I mean, they still were going to have famine, but people did not need to die in that famine. The potato blight affected more than just Ireland, but circumstances in Ireland, policies of the British government in particular, had a lot to do with the tragedy there. And then you add on to that, it's not just about the deaths, the suffering that goes on in Ireland, but about the emigration, the people who are fleeing the country or being forced out by the government. Evicted, basically. So, very tragic period, and that's where you really tend to hear a lot about the hungry grass, the hungry man. I just want to make it clear that both of those stories are far older, and this is by far not the worst famine Ireland has ever had in terms of percentage of population dying. It is, however, in some ways one of the worst they've had in terms of losing population, which is related, but a little different because the circumstances are different. Anyway, enough about that. I don't know exactly what they're going to cover here. I know they're going to cover a little bit of the history and a little bit of the folklore. The channel's name is Juror. It is an Irish channel, as far as I can tell anyway. I haven't seen it yet, so I will include a link to it down in the description below. If you like what you see here, please consider heading over to that channel and joining them to support. If you're interested in Irish stuff, they do a lot of Irish stuff, so it's worth looking at them if you are interested in Ireland. Anyway, I've got an ulterior motive for watching this. I am actually working on a novel right now that is based on the Irish potato famine in the second half of the 1840s. And a big part of the theme of that story is going to be centered around the legend of the hungry man and the hungry grass. It's going to be a historical fiction. I'm going to root it very heavily in the history, but I want the folklore there because it was there. It was part of everything that was going on. There were people there who absolutely believed in and feared the Fear Gorta and the Féar Gortach, the hungry man, the hungry grass. There were even some of the devout Catholics still had this fear of the boogeyman, of these things that couldn't be explained that were part of this famine, of the horrors that were going on around them. And this isn't unique. You see stories like this emerging from catastrophes like this. And it's, when you think about it, it makes sense. When everything around you is collapsing, you're afraid, you're terrified, and you're looking for explanations. So, and your grandmother probably told you the stories of the hungry man and the hungry grass. So that's where your mind goes. Anyway, let's get into this and let's learn a little bit about the Great Famine and the hungry man and the hungry grass. And to all my Irish viewers, if there are any yet, I apologize if I'm butchering the pronunciations. I did take a semester of Irish back in the day, but it was a while back, and I don't remember much. So, I'm sorry about that.
Hey everyone! Decided to get back to one of the reasons I made my channel, to talk about our folklore and history. If you listen to Irish folklore, you may have heard of the Fear Gorta,
Right?
meaning famine man, or the Féar Gortach, that is the hungry or famine grass. The famine man is a skeletal being that...
I'm going to turn off the closed captions because they're not right anyway. They're just going to confuse me.
...signals death and appears in human form. Féar Gortach is a folklore tale of a cursed patch of land where if you step, you are doomed to die of starvation,
Right.
no matter how much you eat. The hungry man and hungry grass have two origins, but the awful outcome facing either is very much the same. I have to tell you about the Irish famine and talk about the history before I can tell you about the Féar Gorta, or the hungry grass. They both originate from the most dreadful and darkest times in our Irish history. Like many folklore tales that are steeped in history, where truth and myths get entwined with the telling of the story. It has many names: the Irish Great Hunger, the Great Famine, the Irish Potato Famine. Whatever you choose to call it, there is no way it can describe the despair, death and absolute devastating effects on our country and what our ancestors had to endure. Religious and class discrimination, slave labour, starvation and forced exile in cold and never-ending winters. Penal laws under British rule meant that parliamentary officials were mainly British and their male descendants who had been granted landed estates in Ireland. Catholics previously had their land confiscated and now had to settle for leasing their own land back from the now British landowners. The potato was only brought to Ireland in the 18th century, but soon became a staple due to being hardy and surviving our weather. It was cheap and went far to feed many a hungry mouth. Potatoes became infested with an airborne fungus known as potato blight. It is believed the fungus was carried by the wind across the Irish Sea and began destroying our Irish crops. Corn laws which existed had a high tariff to protect British corn prices.
Right.
This, with the continued exploitation by British landowners and merchants, meant a food shortage. It brought Ireland and its people to its very knees.
All right, let's stop right here. Some things to unpack here. First of all, I mentioned it earlier, but potato blight hit more than just Ireland. It started, as far as I know, here in the United States, and then it spread across Europe. Germany got hit fairly hard by it, I know. Pretty much all of northwestern and western Europe and the islands, England, Scotland, Wales, and of course Ireland. But while people suffered everywhere, nothing came close to what happened in Ireland. And that's because there's a perfect storm of things going on in Ireland at this time. So one of the big problems was you had a lot of British landlords over there. They were working on something similar to a plantation system. The landlord owned the land the village was built on. You would grow your crops. Most of those crops are going to go to pay your rent. So you're dependent on most of what you're growing as a tenant farmer in Ireland is going to your landlord. It's going to taxes. It's going to everybody but you, basically. Throughout the famine years, Ireland was exporting a ridiculous amount of food. And that is really the heart of the problem. You did have corn laws in place, which were fight price fixing in order to ensure that British crops were not undercut, which also helped create some of these problems. But when they say corn, we're not talking about maize, we're talking about grains in general. Depending on where you are in Ireland, a common one would be oats, but sometimes you'd see some barley, some wheat. So Ireland is growing plenty of food, they're exporting a lot. These poor tenant farmers, all they have left are the potatoes. Why the potatoes? Because they're a very efficient crop, especially in poor soil conditions like you have in parts of Western Ireland. County Mayo comes to mind as one of the areas that was hardest hit. And one of the reasons for that is what you can grow there is pretty limited, and what you do grow, again, is going to your landlord or to the tax collectors, so on and so forth. So they would grow the grains, the corn, if you want to use that term, for paying off their debts of all types, and then all they had left were the potatoes, and they were a nutritious meal. The Irish were actually probably eating better in terms of nutrition than a lot of the British were at the time, which is kind of ironic. Well, not at the time, but going into the famine, because potatoes are very nutritious, and they're kind of good for the Irish. But if the potatoes are gone, all you've got left are the other crops you're growing, but those aren't yours. Those belong to your landlord. There's the problem. And especially initially, the British really aren't interested in fixing this problem because they don't think there is a problem. Some of it's just outright denial. They don't want to believe it. They think it's being exaggerated in the early years. A lot of the landlords are absentee. They're back in England in their estates. They own the land, but they've got agents that are responsible for overseeing the labor, collecting the rent, and making sure the taxes are paid, all that kind of thing. And the early efforts to deal with the famine were pretty minimal. They do Peel, I believe it was Peel, tries to bring in American maize at one point to help alleviate some of the starvation there, but that doesn't work well. Maize doesn't really grow well in Ireland at all, and the Irish people weren't used to it. They didn't have the means to properly prepare and cook it, so it was there, but it actually did more harm than good, to be completely frank about it. Let's see what else they got to say before I get too deep into this, because this is something I really get. When it comes to famine, I tend to dig in, so I'm going to have to pull myself out of it. Let's keep going.
When things were thought to be at its very worst, Charles Trevelyan was brought in to assist with the relief, but turned out to be one of the most hated men in Irish history. Trevelyan was a civil servant with no compassion or empathy to the Irish people he was asked to assist. His plans to create employment and restart the economy were long and complicated and turned out to be a complete failure. The government believed this blight would be short-lived, but they couldn't have been more wrong.
Black 47.
British Prime Minister at the time, Robert Peel, had been supplying Ireland with corn imports, but when he left office in 1846, Trevelyan took complete control and cut off Ireland from receiving any further help, even though his plan to create a working economy had failed drastically. Instead of sending food, Trevelyan sent soldiers to try and instill order. When one of the most brutal winters hit Ireland, he forced 500,000 out to build roads. Men, women and children, barely clothed and starving. Many would drop dead where they stood.
Okay, let's talk a little bit about Trevelyan. He is very much viewed as a villain in Ireland. He is also involved in the Bengali, I think it's the Bengali famine. It's a famine in India, but I don't remember exactly which one it is off the top of my head. Where he does much better overall, although it's still terrible. Yeah, the way he handles the Irish famine is horrific. And we can debate how much of it was a lack of compassion or deliberate malice. There's some people who genuinely hate the man, but that's beyond what we need to get into here. What I will say is that this was a period when there was two things going on that Trevelyan was kind of involved with. One was Malthusianism. Thomas Malthus had written on the nature of famine, and it basically said that food supplies only grow by a linear progression, populations grow geometrically, the land can only support so much, and famine is the cure for overpopulation. It's basically the takeaway that many people took out of Malthus's original writings. He does come back and redefine some of his writings later, but the initial writings, basically the takeaway a lot of people had was famine is nature's way of saying you've got too many people. And there were a lot of people, especially in England, who viewed the potato famine in Ireland as these Catholics are having way too many children. They've raised their population above what the land can support, and this is nature's way of dealing with that. And that's paired with laissez-faire capitalism, which they were kind of heavily into at this time as well. Leave the market alone, the market will take care of the situation. Except they weren't leaving the market alone. The Corn Laws were a prime example. It's one reason they were repealed was, oh well, we're messing with with capitalism. Let's repeal these laws, and now the economy will take care of it. It didn't. If anything, it made it worse. There were a lot of things like this going on, but yeah, the belief in Malthus and the belief in laissez-faire capitalism definitely had a lot to do with it. And Trevelyan was kind of on board with both of those ideologies. He saw what was happening to Ireland as, in part, God's punishment, because they're Catholic, not Protestant, and part nature's punishment. They've got too many children, more than the land can sustain, which is ridiculous when you consider that most of the food being grown there was being exported. They had plenty of food. It was never a matter of not having the food. It was the food staying there that was the issue. So you kind of get some of what's going on here. And you can probably understand why a lot of the Irish really hated this man.
1847 would become known as Black 47, the worst year of the Great Hunger. The population was starving and worked for hardly any wages or food. Disease ravaged Ireland, and most dying from this rather than malnutrition. Finally, all Trevelyan's projects were shut down, and soup kitchens and charities were introduced, but it was all too slow and too late. 1847 saw the third potato harvest failure. As time passed, landowners wanted their land back to farm. The tenants couldn't grow their own crop, couldn't work, and hadn't paid rent in years. As if starvation and disease wasn't enough, they were now being evicted from their homes. Over 500,000 were evicted, with a further 100,000 been forced to emigrate to North America with false promises of a better life.
Not just North America. That was a popular, and by popular I mean that's where a lot of them went, but quite a few went to England. Liverpool, for example, had a huge upswell in Irish population. Some were sent to places like Botany Bay in Australia. So this wasn't just Ireland to North America. This was Ireland to the rest of the world. But yes, a significant portion did go to North America, and not just the United States. Canada got quite a few too.
Their transport would become known as the coffin ships. The so-called coffin ships were barely seaworthy, packed with starved families ravaged by disease. The first coffin ship headed to Quebec, Canada. The 3,000-mile journey, depending on winds, would take from 40 days to 3 months. In the spring of 1847, shipload after shipload of fevered Irish arrived, promised by landlords back home that an agent would greet them. They knew the Irish would never ever make it back to Ireland to put a claim in on their land. They were instead put in quarantine on board the ships, and the bodies were thrown into the sea. Others, half alive, were dumped on Gross Island and crawled on their hands and knees to the makeshift fever hospitals. Many died on the roadside. They were not welcomed by the mainly Puritan communities of Canada and North America. Back in Ireland,
Yeah, I mean, look at this ship here. Barclark from County Sligo is 440 passengers. 108 of them die. 150 are sick. That's well over half of them right there. Well over. I think a quarter of them basically died. Not good. My own family, I've got ancestors that came over from Ireland. Hanging on the wall over here, I have a copy of their family tree from their Bible. And they left Ireland, according to family tradition, in 1848. I can't find any trace of them in the United States until 1851, where I'm fairly certain that they actually spent 2 or 3 years in Liverpool before coming here. But they came over on a ship like this, and I'm sure it had statistics that could potentially be just as horrifying. A lot of these ships were massively overfilled. I said this in a previous video on Leningrad, but the number one killer in famine isn't hunger. It's really hard to starve yourself to death. It can be done, but it's very rare. Far more often, long before you literally starve to death, you die of disease. So if you're packing 100, 200, 300, 400, 500 people in a ship that are all stricken with famine, they all have very weakened physiology, their immune system is trashed, they're weak, they're barely able to function, disease is going to spread like wildfire. So this is not at all shocking that this happened. This is just asking for this kind of thing.
Trevelyan fought to save his career by blaming the Irish landowners for the years of horror inflicted on the Irish people. Ireland was left in financial ruin. The Poor Law, which had been introduced, forced landowners over a quarter of an acre to sign over any assets to receive aid. Workhouses were cramped full with widows and children, and if Trevelyan had had his way, they would have been thrown out onto the streets to make room for those fit to work.
Yep.
Families were forced to camp anywhere in the harsh, cold winters.
The workhouses, the poor laws were pretty draconian because they were designed specifically so that nobody would want to use them except as the absolute last resort. They were designed that way. The British government did not want people taking advantage of these, so they made it so that people would rather die than go to these places in some cases, or leave the country. They did have at various times soup kitchens, especially the Protestant and both churches, the Protestants and the Catholics, tried to run soup kitchens when and where they could. But in the case of the Protestants, they often required conversion before you could get soup, which was also a huge problem because it forces people to choose between survival and their faith, and just put people in a position where they really don't have a right answer. If you're a devout Catholic at this period, you might see conversion as being the same as damning yourself. And so, damned if you do, damned if you don't, literally in this case. Really terrible stuff. But yeah, the workhouses, you went to the workhouse, you were put to work, period. Doesn't matter how old you were, whether you're a child or elderly, whatever. You were put to work, and it was usually menial, meaningless work, building roads that go nowhere, breaking rocks, clearing fields. Sometimes they had practical value. A lot of times it was make work, and it was sun up to sundown. It was not, like I said, it was designed to make you not want to be there. And again, it was a breeding ground for disease, because you're packing these houses full of the sickest of the sick, the weakest of the weak, the people who are the most desperate, they're going to be the most vulnerable to disease. So just a horrible situation any way you look at it. And he mentioned with Trevelyan, you do switch policy to where the landlords become responsible for famine relief, and that backfires, at least if you're one of the victims, it backfires horribly as well. Because, again, a lot of these landlords are absentee. All they care about is making their money. Most of them have rarely, if ever, even been to this land. They have no concept of what's really going on. A lot of them really don't believe the press is coming out of here. All they know is now they're being told that they're going to have to make sure all their tenants are fed and so on and so forth. So what's the solution to that? Get rid of your tenants. If you're responsible for taking care of them in every way and they're relying on support, one way to deal with that and still turn a profit is just to get rid of as many of them as you can. So that's why in Black 47 you see this huge uptick in evictions. They're now no longer going to have any patience or pity. Because it's against their interest to keep you there if you can't pay. Because then they're going to have to support you. So you see a huge upsurge in evictions at this time. Again, just policy after policy it might even have been well-intentioned, but it has the opposite effect time and time again in this period.
I've included some photographs of a workhouse in County Antrim. When I found out it was actually the graveyard of the workhouse, we didn't go anymore. It now always fills me with sadness of the desperate and starved people laid there in their final resting place. I will be doing a deeper dive into our workhouses and poorhouses in the future. Soon the workhouses were even full and riddled with debt, and British government refused to fund them any longer due to non-payment of taxes. Instead of sending help, the government sent soldiers to control the situation. There was whispers of rebellion, and the government threatened exile to Botany Bay and internment. Ireland was a ghost nation. Cottages abandoned, families gone, fields empty. The workhouses were rife with disease, people living in filth, the violent and mentally ill, all threw in together with families and infants. Food was minimal at best. The hope gone from their sunken eyes and rags for their clothes. Death was common, and the ravaged bodies were thrown onto carts and tipped into mass graves. These poor souls never even received a blessing, their souls condemned to purgatory. All over Ireland, these mass graves appeared on our famine graveyards. In later years, many became memorialised and consecrated ground. Some, however, remained buried in cold, unhallowed ground, forgotten souls.
And this is where we start getting the stories. This is the source of the idea of the hungry grass. But I'm sure that's where we're headed now.
Crying out for their purgatory to end. Over the top of these burial sites, the grass grew sparsely, and it was cursed. It was hungry. With the horror of the famine, it is no surprise to hear tales born from it. The Féar Gorta is one of the most feared fairies in Irish folklore.
You often, in modern art and images, see Féar Gorta portrayed this way. That's really not that accurate, at least from my understanding of the legends. I've read several contemporary accounts, one work of fiction written by an Irishman during this period, as well as some works from folklorists and so on. Féar Gorta is most often described as an emaciated, skeletal-like figure. And I say skeletal-like because if you look at accounts of famine, a good example from the past would be in the 1921 Russian famine, when they sent the American Relief Association over to help the Soviet Union deal with that famine. Some of the ARA workers described in their journals and their reports seeing crowds of emaciated people walking around, little more than skeletons. That's almost verbatim what they're describing. And that's kind of what we're talking about with the hungry man, the Féar Gorta. Or Féar Gorta, excuse me. I get those two backwards all the time, too. It's, at least on surface level, it should be indistinguishable from a severe famine victim. It should not be a zombie or ghoul-like image. It should be horrifying, but real in the sense that it looks like a famine victim. There might be some tells depending on which legend and myth you're looking at, but in general, it's indistinguishable. One of the fears is if you pass a stranger on the street who's begging for food, you need to give him some because he might possibly be the Féar Gorta. So it's not going to be something that's obvious at a casual glance to recognize from a real famine victim.
Hunger follows in his footsteps. He is a lone, gaunt, emaciated figure. As I've said before, he is not to be confused with Féar Gortach or the hungry grass, which is related but separate. It is a patch of land covered in sparse grass, where whoever is to step on it would starve to death, no matter how much they ate. They could fill their bellies time and time again, but to no avail, eventually starving to death. Some say the Féar Gorta would rise up when sacred plots of land were disrespected. This would probably be one of the reasons I stopped walking Jasper on the one at the workhouse. Keeping a crust of bread in your pocket or sprinkling crumbs over the patch of grass was thought to protect you, and even burning the field would see it off for good. Alas, there is no such protection from the hungry man. If he came to your door, you would be best to feed him, and you'll definitely know him by the greenish hue to his emaciated.
And that would probably be a more accurate image of what the legends that I read anyway would describe. It could be, it's human, but it's not. It's human at the height of famine. In fact, just look at some of the news reporting coming out of Gaza right now. They'll describe these as walking skeletons. And this is what we're talking about.
Body. He'll have his empty begging bowl and be dressed in rags. Although he is much feared, if he was fed, he could be generous, but woe betide anyone who mocked him, for he retaliated without mercy, cursing bad luck and hunger to the end of their days. He has made kings into paupers and paupers into princes. He will always be a reminder of the famine, the disaster and despair on our ancestors. Now remember to always carry a crust of bread, friends, in your pocket, and you'll be grand. I'll end it there, and I'll see you next time for some more Irish folklore.
Yeah, something that is also important with the legend of the hungry man is that it wasn't necessarily malevolent. Sometimes you'll hear it portrayed that way, but it really, from the earlier myths that I've read, doesn't seem to be a malevolent spirit. What it is it is a victim of the famine. It is a symptom of the famine. It is eternally hungry. If you walk past it and you don't give it food, you might be cursed. It can be misfortune. And the stories vary on this a lot too. You could be afflicted with misfortune. Things can just keep going more and more wrong until you're basically in despair. But more often, you become increasingly hungry and famished yourself. That is the more traditional. However, if you give the Féar Gorta a little bit of food or bread, some versions of the stories, you will be blessed in various ways. You'll be protected from the famine. So it's not necessarily a malevolent spirit or a malevolent fae. Sometimes the Féar Gorta is described as one of the fairy folk. Sometimes he's described as a revenant. It's really unclear. I've even seen An Gorta, the hungry man, and then sometimes you'll see it referred to as the hungry man. You'll see it as an idea that there's many of them. Most of the stuff I've read feels to me more like they're talking about a singular entity, an embodiment of famine, if you will. And yeah, the hungry grass, cursed land. If you cross it, you will be cursed with famine yourself. unless you leave an offering of food. So, and it's often, as she mentioned, associated with mass burials of famine victims. But in other stories, it is a place where the fairy folk have cursed the land because it is the crossing between their world and ours. In other versions, it's where the Fear Gorta rises into our realm from the realm beyond, wherever he dwells when there's no famine. Again, stories vary. But it's an interesting story, it's an interesting concept, and this isn't unique to Ireland. There are other spirits, supernatural beings associated with famine in other countries. And witches are often associated with famine in many countries. So when disaster strikes the land, there's almost always going to be stories like this rising up in their wake, whether it be witchcraft, whether it be hungry spirits, ghosts, or, in this case, a living, walking embodiment of famine, a hungry man. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed that. We will continue doing at least one more, hopefully 2 more videos on ghost goblins and things that go bump in the night before the month is over. If you guys have any suggestions on anything you'd like to talk about, witches or vampires, werewolves, whatever, or just a specific country or region or time you'd like to take a look at, or origins of things like Halloween or whatever. If you have any ideas that you'd like to see, feel free to toss me a suggestion. Otherwise, I'll just poke around until I find something for next week. And until then, thank you for joining me. I'll see you all next time. Bye-bye.